Good evening. Welcome to the 2020 Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference Evening Reading Series. My name is Sean Hill, and I am the conference director. This is our 8th conference, and this evening we're about to hear the 4th of our 6 readers this week, Scott Russell Sanders. I've heard Scott read before, and I'm thrilled to hear him read tonight. We have gathered a small gallery to give Scott a sense of all of you gathering this evening. We will represent you well. Sarah Dennison, our conference administrator, and I will moderate the Q&A following the reading. There are a few people and entities I need to thank on behalf of the conference and myself. So, here we go. I want to thank the poets collected in the New Poets of Native Nations anthology and Hyde Erdrich, its editor, and Grey Wolf Press for their generous donation in support of the New Poets of Native Nations Women's Scholarship. I also want to thank an anonymous past MNWC participant for their generous donation in support of the Charles W. Scrutcheon Emerging Writer of Color Award, or Scholarship. This conference is supported in part by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So thank you, Minnesotans. And I want to thank Bemidji State University for its support. We are grateful for our place in the Northwoods at Bemidji State University beside the lake known as Bemidji Gamog, where the river crosses, which has been a sacred gathering place for countless generations of indigenous peoples, including Dakota, Lakota, and Anishinaabeg, who remain the spiritual caretakers and thriving members of the greater community to which we all belong, situated as we are between 3 Ojibwe reservations, Leech Lake, White Earth, and Red Lake. We recognize and support the sovereignty of Native nations. We will continue to work with Indigenous teachers, elders, and youth to protect and honor all of our relationships with the land, all our relatives, and the truth. So, Scott Russell Sanders is a prolific, award-winning, widely recognized and anthologized, much loved author of more than 20 books of fiction and nonfiction, including A Conservationist Manifesto, Hunting for Hope, A Private History of Awe, Earthworks Selected Essays, and the eco-sci-fi short story collection Dancing in Dreamtime. His latest book, The Way of Imagination, is forthcoming later this summer from Counterpoint Press. I believe August 11th. Look for it. Among his honors are the Lannan Literary Award, the John Burroughs Essay Award, the Mark Twain Award, the Cecil Woods Award for Nonfiction, the Eugene and Marilyn Glick Indiana Authors Award, and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2012, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He is a distinguished professor emeritus of English at the Indiana University and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He and his wife, Ruth, the biochemist, have reared 2 children in their hometown in Bloomington in the Hardwood Hill country of southern Indiana. It is with great pleasure I give you Scott Russell Sanders.
Thank you, Sean. And thanks to Sean Hill, Sean Cruz, Sarah Dennison, all the other people who have created this space for all of us to share our love of writing, our love of reading, and our concerns. And thanks to the folks in my workshop who are producing wonderful writing and who are commenting on one another's work with lively and perceptive comments. And I've thoroughly enjoyed the presentations by my fellow faculty members, and I'm sure I will enjoy the remaining two evening readings. I'm going to read to you, first of all, I'm going to call this up. I'm going to read to you now it's gone away, there it is. I'm going to read to you from a book that I finished, I'm pretty sure it's finished, this spring. I've been working on it for a number of years. It's a collaboration between myself and a man named Peter Forbes, who lives in Vermont, runs a farm and a retreat center for social justice and conservation activists with his wife. They raise sheep, blueberries, and consciousness on this beautiful farm. This is their farm pond in the mountains across the valley from their farm. So Peter Forbes and I began collaborating about 5 years ago in making a book with his photographs and short stories by me, inspired by his photographs. And I'm going to read you 6 of them. That sounds like a lot, but they're only about 600 words long, each of them. Here's Peter. And I will show you each photograph that inspired a story, and I might say a word or two afterwards. But initially, I just give you the photograph. And my process in making this book, there are 50 stories and 50 matched with photographs. My process was to go through several hundred photographs that Peter had sent to me, digital copies. And every time a photograph intrigued me, caught my attention, I felt it was asking me to write about it. And sometimes the writing, the voice that I heard, often it would be of a figure in the picture, not always. Sometimes it was third person. When I heard a voice, a narrative voice, I would begin writing. And anyone can tell you it's much harder to write a story that's 600 words long than a story that's 6,000 words long and make it a whole story. So it was a challenge to write these small, compact stories in response to photographs. Here's the first one. It's called Storyteller. My role in the village is to entertain children with stories while their mothers and grandmothers visit in the market or muse in the shade of almond trees or lie down in the hot afternoon to nap. I give the women an hour of peace. The rest of the day, they cook, they clean, they hang out laundry, nurse babies, settle quarrels, and answer questions that pour out of each child like water from a spring. Because our village is poor, I receive no pay for telling stories, but I am welcome at every table. This welcome is worth more to me than money, for I have no table of my own, no house, no family. I know nothing of my origins. They say that one day I wandered into the village, barely a toddler, my eyes open wide, ashes on my clothes, the smell of smoke in my hair. It was a time of war. I could not speak, could not even say my name, so people called me Exposito, which means foundling or orphan in our language. Soon I came to be known as Posy. A traveler once told me that in a distant land, there is a word with the same sound, posy, that means a flower. What I know of the great world, I learned chiefly from travelers, for I have not acquired the magic of reading. And I have rarely stirred from this place since arriving here with the smell of smoke in my hair. No one ever came looking for me. Perhaps my parents and all my relatives had died in the war. Who could care for so many orphans? Here in the village, every house was already crowded. No one adopted me as their own. Instead, I was passed from family to family, a few nights here, a few nights there. In each home, I was well fed and wrapped in kindness. I was given hand-me-down clothes to wear, larger sizes year by year. The children treated me like a visiting cousin. In their company, I slowly learned to speak. When I spoke, what came out was stories, simple ones at first, and then longer ones, and eventually tales that tumbled on from supper until bedtime. Now, in whatever house has welcomed me, I wake each morning at first light. While roosters call, I gaze into my small mirror and paint my face white. Not the sickly white of those pale people who are said to live in northern countries, but the white of clouds, of sea foam, of snow. I paint my lips and eyebrows black. I put on a white shirt, black bow tie, brown apron with pockets for surprises, and black bowler hat. Then I go out to the cobblestone street and wait. Soon the little ones gather around me, each bringing a gift of food in outstretched hands. The hands are brown, like our mountains, and so are the faces and the curious gleaming eyes. Their hair is the color of moonless midnight. Though they know me well, the children stare at me as if I were a stranger fallen from the sky. Each day I tell them a different story. I tell how tiny weavers in the clouds fashion snowflakes that fall on the mountains. I tell how the mountains dance at night, shaking the ground. I tell how rivers give birth to snakes, and snakes give birth to rain. I tell how spiders spin a rope to the moon to keep it circling about the earth. I tell how volcanoes cook dragon meat for the sun. I tell how the sun sleeps at night on the back of a giant llama and wakes to light the world again when the llama shivers with cold. As they listen, the children reach into the pockets of my apron and draw out the treasures I have gathered. Perhaps a parrot's green feather, fish scales, a glass ball washed in by the surf, a rosy pebble, a curved claw, a coin. They listen with their mouths open, wondering. I also wonder. I do not know where the stories come from or where they go. They arrive and depart like the wind, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a roar. So that's storyteller. I never asked Peter where this village is, and I read this story last fall in Oregon at another writers conference. And a woman in the audience came up afterwards and said, told me the name of a village in Guatemala. And I said, oh, that's wonderful to know. How do you know that? She said, well, my husband's an anthropologist and he studies in that village. And you can tell the village by the dress that the girl in the foreground is wearing, because that's a dress design and pattern that only that village uses. Each village has a distinct style of that sort. So this is in Guatemala, but I only learned that from somebody in an audience. So this one is called Letter. Letter. My life changed the day I climbed a pine tree in our backyard, hooked my knees over a limb and dangled upside down. Suddenly, the world turned topsy-turvy. Trees grew out of the sky, which was solid and green instead of airy and blue. Birds flew beneath me over a carpet of clouds. The road snaked overhead, and cars rolled along it like bugs scurrying across a ceiling. Our house hung down from a fenced-in patch of gardens and flower beds. Heaven and earth had switched places. If I died right then, I wondered, would my soul burrow into the dirt, deep among the roots and rocks, and could God find me so far from paradise? Blood pounded in my head and my eyes ached from staring. The rough bark rasped the backs of my knees. So I pulled myself upright, waited for the dizziness to pass, and climbed down from the tree. The next day I repeated the trick, curious to see the world from a new angle. Of course, back then I didn't know my life had changed. I learned this gradually over the years. I must have been 5 or 6 that summer. I had watched my 3 older brothers hang upside down from branches and monkey bars and barn rafters many times before I dared to do so myself. I was the only girl in our family, and I wanted to be a boy. I wanted to be strong and brave and bold as my brothers were. I wanted to drive tractors and combines as my father did. Wanted to play poker and drink beer and swear. Eventually, my body insisted I was a girl, like it or not. I swelled in all the ways that drew the stares of boys. During my last year in high school, my father injured his back and got laid off at the tire plant. Our health insurance disappeared along with his job. What my mother earned from cleaning motel rooms, what my brothers sent home from their army pay, and what I pitched in from waitressing on weekends, all this added together still would not cover the mortgage. The summer after my graduation, we lost our farm to the bank. Within weeks, a developer bought the place. The pine tree was cut down, the house was demolished, the gardens were gouged out, and the dirt was scraped flat to make room for a box store surrounded by 10 acres of blacktop. Before I saw the world topsy-turvy, I might have accepted this change as progress, but I knew it was desecration. I worked my way through college, where I began by studying economics, hoping to figure out what had ruined my father, my family, and our farm, and what had set my brothers to fight overseas. But economics only taught me about markets and capital, supply and demand, profit and loss, without mentioning any values other than the pursuit of money. I switched my major to anthropology, and soon began to see the world from new angles, as if I were dangling upside down from that pine tree. I learned of economies based on barter and sharing. I learned of cultures that did not believe in private ownership of land, since they regarded other species as kindred and earth as holy. I learned of societies governed by women, societies devoted to art or prayer, societies that prized cooperation and generosity rather than competition and greed, even societies that never went to war. All of this revealed that the America in which I had grown up represented only one way humans had contrived to live together, and not the best or kindest way, where it ravaged the land and plunged millions of people into misery. I am in jail as I write these lines for refusing to unchain myself from the door of a bank. 9 of us were arrested, including the 2 of my brothers who survived our latest war. The body of my 3rd brother has not been recovered. Our jailers are kind, even apologetic. They have suffered losses of their own. They don't complain of our singing. They allow us to read and write, which is why I can send you these words. I wrote essays for many years before I returned to fiction, which was my first love, fiction. And when you're writing essays, at least the sort of personal and argumentative essays that I write, the voice on the page is your voice, the mind at work on the page is your own mind. Yes, you draw on knowledge and insights from other people, but finally it's a monologue. And what fiction allows me to do, and especially this book of 50 very brief stories allows me to do, is to inhabit minds and lives and circumstances very different from my own. When one does that, of course, when a male tries to imagine inwardness of a female, or a white person tries to imagine the inwardness of a person of color, or a person of the Western world tries to imagine the inward life of someone in Africa. You're going to get part of it wrong. Maybe you'll get a lot of it wrong. And often writers are discouraged from doing so, or fearful of doing so. On the other hand, imagination, which is what one is exercising when what one tries to envision, to inhabit, however imperfectly, the consciousness, the circumstances of a person quite different from yourself. Imagination is the source of empathy and compassion. If we can't imagine others as akin to us in some manner, if we can't imagine them as related to us in some manner, we can't feel empathy for them, we can't feel compassion for them, and we will simply sustain all the brutal divisions that the world suffers from. So I'm always encouraging writers to stretch themselves, to take the risk of being mistaken, of not getting it right. One of the reasons we get friends and others to read our work is to tell us where, in their view, we didn't get it right. This book of 50 stories, I inhabit or move into 50 points of view, circumstances, very different from my own. It includes non-human creatures as well. There's one told from the group, a point of view of sheep, which speak in the first person plural. They only speak in we. And there'll be an example of a non-traditional human at the end of the reading. I had to look at this photograph many, many times over months and even more than a year before I understood it. I immediately knew I wanted to write about it, but it took me a year at least to figure out what story it wanted me to tell. And here's the story. And the accent you hear me putting on is supposedly an Alabama accent. My father was from Mississippi, and I was reared by a man who sounded like a Mississippian his whole life. And I was born in Tennessee, and I had aunts and uncles in Alabama. So it's a poor approximation of what my father and my aunts and uncles had a very good version of, which was a deep South accent. I thought I was a good man. After all, I was a faithful husband, a loving father, a deacon in my church. I coached Little League Baseball, served on the boards of charities, donated generously to good causes from my earnings as a realtor. If a friend was in trouble, I helped out. If one of my relatives fell sick or lost a job, I sent a check. When my parents grew too feeble to manage their house, I moved them into a condo. And when they grew too forgetful to manage the condo, I moved them into Birmingham's finest nursing home. In light of the values I learned while growing up, I considered myself, as I say, a good man. Yet something nagged at me, a voice whispering that my dutiful life was deeply flawed. Call it conscience, if you will. When I was a child and was troubled by scary thoughts, my mother told me to imagine they came from a devil who sat on my left shoulder, while a comforting angel sat on my right. Listen for the angel, she urged me. The whisper I began hearing in my 40s, at the peak of my business career, and as it turned out, of my reputation as a pillar of the community, came from neither shoulder, but from my heart. It was an ache as much as a voice. I noticed it first while ushering at church one Sunday, when a family of Negroes, as I had been taught to call them, showed up at the door. A father and mother and 2 children all neatly dressed. What to do? I couldn't turn them away, but I explained that they might feel awkward as the only people of their kind in the church. The father said he wanted his children to see how white Southern Baptists worshiped. So I led them to a pew at the back of the sanctuary where they would be least noticed and from which they could swiftly depart after the service. Through the hymns and prayers and sermon, I told myself that I had acted properly with due regard for the feelings of this Negro family. But a contrary voice from within told me I had acted shabbily. I should have welcomed them in and invited them to sit wherever they pleased. That voice became more insistent, not only in church, but also in my real estate office, at the country club, and in bed as I lay brooding. How can you be a good man, the voice demanded, while you carry the mental stain of slaveholders? How can you be a good man while hiding out in an all-white world? Over a quarter of Alabama's citizens and over half of Birmingham's are Black. You see Black people every day on the streets and in stores and restaurants. You sell them houses, but you guide them into all Black neighborhoods where banks offer loans at inflated rates. You sit next to them at lunch counters, stand near them in line, but rarely do more than nod hello. Blacks are excluded from your country club as they are from your church, not by official rules, but by long custom. Those few who serve on boards with you disappear from your thoughts as soon as the meetings end. Most shameful of all, no Black person has ever entered your home except to clean, make a delivery, or perform some other service. Like your ancestors, you have clung to this purblind way out of fear. Fear not so much of Black people, about whom you know little, as of whites. If you violate the unwritten code, what will your neighbors and customers and kinfolk think of you? Will they kick you out of their clubs, ruin your business, shun you and your family? Maybe so, but you'll have to run that risk if you wish to live in peace with yourself. I'm far from being at peace, but I'm closer than I was before I began hearing that voice. I imagine it coming from the center of my chest, from the lips of a man who is about my age, his chocolate skin still smooth, but his hair beginning to gray, his eyes peering solemnly through spectacles, my double, my shadow, a man who sees both sides of this poisonous divide, bearing a history of grief that I have only begun to fathom. Those are hard voices, and there's one more hard voice to come, but here's a happier one. This is a child's voice, and this one is in third person limited. Fiction writers know about that. It's all told from the point of view of a child named Krista. It's called Moon. Krista first began puzzling about the moon one night when her daddy was carrying her half asleep from the car to the house. And she looked up to see a bright, shining ball which she tried to pluck from the sky. But her arms were too short. So she asked her daddy to bring it down with his long arms. He laughed and said, "I wish I could, sweetums, but the moon is far, far away." Just how far away her daddy could not say, nor could her mommy. So Krista asked the babysitter, a big girl named Faye, who tugged a phone from the hip pocket of her jeans, punched a few buttons, stared at the screen and said, "An average of 238,855 miles. "How far is that?" Krista asked. Faye tapped a purple fingernail against her nose, shrugged, then called her boyfriend. Over the phone, the boyfriend told Krista, if the earth wore a belt around its waist, you would need 1,000 of those belts stretched end to end to reach the moon. How much is 1,000? I'll be right over, said the boyfriend, whose name was Teddy and who was forbidden to set foot in the house when her parents were away. Soon he arrived carrying a jar filled with marbles. After he finished kissing Faye, which took a while, he poured the marbles onto the living room rug. Can you count to 100? He asked Krista. She nodded. Great, he said. So gather 100 marbles into a clump and do that 9 more times. Then he pulled Faye onto the couch where they resumed kissing. Krista plopped onto the rug and started counting. By the time she had made 10 clumps of marbles, Faye and Teddy were all tangled up on the couch. To get their attention, she hollered, all done! Faye jerked upright and her lips came unstuck from Teddy's. Good for you, she muttered. Now go to bed. Not until I know what the moon is made of, Krista pleaded. Teddy turned on her a grumpy face that was smeared with purple lipstick. Rocks, he said. But rocks are hard, said Krista, so why is the moon full of dents? Faye sighed. Teddy took a deep breath and said, from collisions with smaller rocks called meteorites. Then what makes the moon's bumps? Krista asked. Faye groaned. Volcanoes, Teddy replied. Krista repeated the word quizzically. Come on, I'll show you, said Teddy, disentangling himself from Faye, who shut her eyes and slumped against the cushions. Krista followed Teddy into the kitchen, where he rummaged through cupboards until he had found vinegar, baking soda, food coloring, dish soap, and a plastic bowl. He ran water into the bowl and placed it on the table. Then he dumped in gobs of baking soda, a squirt of soap, and a bottle of red food coloring. Now you pour the vinegar, he said, handing the bottle to Krista. She sloshed a few glugs into the bowl, then jumped back as red foam swelled over the rim, across the table, and onto the floor. Lunging to grab the bowl, Teddy knocked it over, and red froth splattered onto the refrigerator, stove, cupboards, and walls. Uh-oh, said Krista. Holy crap, Teddy shouted. Faye leapt to her feet, startling Tiger, the cat, who darted from beneath the couch and batted marbles left and right. Just then, the latch on the front door rattled. In came Mommy, who stepped on loose marbles and went sprawling. Daddy followed right behind, carrying a bag of groceries, and then he also went sprawling, and the groceries went flying. Krista dashed toward her fallen parents, crying, I've learned all about the moon. How far are the stars? Change of tone. Okay, so I mentioned that for many of the photographs, there are 2 more to go. Many of the photographs, I had to look at them repeatedly over a long period of time before I began to hear a voice. The voice is not always the narrator's voice, that is a speaker who's in the picture. Sometimes it's an omniscient narrator. But this one I heard right away, and you'll see from the opening line perhaps why it occurred to me. This is a man, as you'll learn, from Kentucky, and I live next to Kentucky and have lots of Kentucky friends, so this is a poor attempt at what's a sweet accent, Kentucky accent. It's called Horse. My horse, Barney, and me don't always see eye to eye. Take right now, for instance. I got a granddaughter coming over in half an hour for a ride, and Barney don't want to be saddled. When I fetched his favorite blanket, he shied away and gave a snort and peeled back his lips. No use tugging on the bridle and making him stand still while I put on the saddle. He'll only swell out his belly when I tighten the girth, then suck it back in to loosen the strap. I can't have my granddaughter riding on a saddle that might slip, so I'll just wait for Barney to change his mind. He's got a mind, which might come as news to folks who think of horses as dumb brutes. He may not be able to read and write, but when you look Barney in the eye, you'll see a world of knowledge shining back at you. His eyes are the color of black plums and near as big. They're bright as mirrors. When the light's just right, I can see half my farm reflected in one of those eyes. Granted, it's a small farm and hilly, mostly woods and pasture, with 9 tillable acres down in the river bottom where I grew tobacco until my daughters made me quit. It's the sort of place where you need a muscly, easygoing, sure-footed horse, one that can pull a plow or carry a rider all day without complaining. Barney fits the bill, except now and again, like this morning, when he lays back his ears and gets ornery. He's a breed called a Rocky Mountain horse. How it got that name, I have no idea, because it was bred up right here in Kentucky. The best looking ones, like Barney, are a solid chocolate color in the body, with the mane and tail the color of cream. This Barney's my 3rd horse with that name. I outlasted the first 2, but this one's likely to outlive me. They've all been geldings. It hurts me in my manhood to cut a stallion, but it sure sweetens his temperament. No telling how cantankerous Barney would be if I'd left him a stud. I can think of some men who'd be improved by gelding. Say you walk in a bar, which I do more often than I should, and there's a loudmouth threatening everybody within earshot and pinching the waitress's bottom. He'd be a likely candidate for the knife. Or take those politicians that's never been in a war, but talk big and send other people's sons to die fighting over some God-forsaken desert that's got oil under it. I lost my son in Iraq. He survived 3 tours, but on the 4th, he stopped to help a woman who had a bomb hid under her dress. He was so blown apart, the Marines wouldn't let us open the coffin when they flew him back. And what was he doing in Iraq? Protecting America? My ass, he was protecting the money of fat cats and the reputations of blowhards. Losing Jimmy is what set me drinking again. I'd spent near 20 years on the wagon, ever since my wife gave birth to him and vowed she'd move back in with her parents and raise him without me if I didn't swear off the bottle. I did swear off and stayed sober until the day a soldier knocked on our door and gave us the news. My wife hollered and pounded on the man's chest. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her away and shut the door. Then we sat on the floor and wept. My wife's about to give up trying to make me quit drinking. My daughters still keep after me the way they did until I quit growing tobacco. But so far, nothing's worked. Deep down, I know they won't stop loving me even if I can't love myself. Barney's another story, and he may just cure me of booze. He's balking at me right now because he smells whiskey on my breath and it ain't even 9 o'clock in the morning. He's telling me I got no business saddling a horse or welcoming a granddaughter stinking like a tavern. He's telling me I'm never going to find Jimmy in that bottle. You can't say it in so many words, of course, but I'll see what he's thinking as soon as I can bring myself to look him in the eye. One of the mysteries of writing, and everybody here at the workshop, I'm sure, has had this experience, is the way in which stories, poems, essays take turns you didn't intend and didn't expect. The imagination, memory, maybe the unconscious cast up things that surprise the writer. You end up rejecting many of those suggestions from the unconscious and the imagination, either because it's preposterous or because it breaks a pattern that you're working on. But if something is sufficiently insistent, you have to honor it and find a place for it. I had no idea that that horse story would end up being about losing a son in Iraq. I thought it was going to be a comic story about a crotchety farmer and an ornery horse. I knew both sorts of creatures as a boy growing up. But the war is in my mind. The U.S. has been in one war or another almost continuously all 74 years of my life. And it kept insisting and arising and made its way into the story. So many people who've read that or heard that say they're very surprised by the turn it takes, and all I can say is, so am I. But I'm also convinced the turn is true. So this is the last one. It's called Selkie. You may know the legend of seals that turn into humans and seduce male seals that turn into humans and seduce human females. So this is my take on that story. And this picture, as soon as I saw it, I thought Selkie. So here goes. Let me get a sip of water. A Selkie takes a great risk in changing from a seal to a man, for he may not be able to change back again. No matter how carefully he hides his pelt, someone may find it. A child playing along the shore may take it for a plaything. A beachcomber may take it for a rug. A fisherman may sell it to the fur dealer. A woman intent on keeping him in her arms may lock it in a chest. Without that pelt, a Selkie cannot return to the sea, nor can he return if he has fallen in love with the woman who called him ashore to father her child. It is said that male Selkies are the seducers, charming female humans with our fathomless dark eyes and our muscles sculpted from swimming. While that may be true for others, it is not so for me. I did not choose to shed my skin and walk on two legs away from the ocean any more than salmon choose to abandon salt water for spawning and death in their native streams. I was summoned from the water by a maiden who wept 7 tears into the cove where I floated, asleep and dreaming. The taste of those tears jolted me awake, drew me onto the sand, out of my skin, and into the maiden's bed. As we lay together, she told me her father was a fisherman who had died at sea, washed overboard in a storm. I had been warned about such women who believe that a son fathered by a Selkie cannot drown and who may trap you on land to help raise the child. But I could not resist her beauty or her sorrow. Her name was Kira. Since her father's death, she had lived alone, for she was an only child, and her mother had died in giving birth to her. She gave me her father's clothes to wear, so my nakedness would not alarm the neighbors. She fed me delicacies from the fish market. I found work at the docks, loading and unloading trawlers. Time poured by. Every night I lay with her, and every night she wept. Eventually, there came a night when Kira did not weep. Laughing, she pressed my hand to her belly, which had begun to swell. A son, she whispered, who cannot drown. Since her tears had ceased, the spell was broken, and I remembered the taste of the sea. As she slept, I stole away from the cottage, found my pelt in its hiding place, changed back into a seal, and slipped into the waves. Since then, 7 years have passed, one for each of the tears that summoned me to shore. All this while, I have been yearning for my son. All this while, he has been learning human ways. From what I know of Selkie pups, fur must be thickening on his body, webs must be growing between his fingers and toes, and his eyes must be darkening from brown to black. Once the human children notice these changes, they will taunt him. Once the villagers discover he is a Selkie, they may hurl him into the sea before he has learned the way of seals. All that has kept me from returning to claim my son is the fear of being charmed once more by Kira. But I dare delay no longer, or I might lose him. So on the night of a spring tide, in the dark of the moon, I lurch onto the sand, shrug free of my skin, and hide it among the boulders. Kira does not rouse as I lie down beside her. My son is asleep in the corner. When I wake, he is gazing down at me with eyes as black as midnight. He studies my hands, which are crossed on my chest, and then peers at my bare feet, which have kicked free of the covers. Who are you? He asks. Kira is humming as she stirs porridge at the peat stove. She pauses her tune long enough to say, he's your father. Her smile fills the cottage with birdsong and dawn light. I sit up in bed the better to see her and think, why rush away? And that's the end of that. So, you can stop the share, get all these faces back. So those are the stories. I left time for questions and comments. We welcome
Before that, we'll give you a round of applause. Please, gallery. Thank you. All right. Yes, questions. Please place your questions in the Q&A. Or gallery, if anyone there has a question, just jump right in.
Scott, I'd love to hear about what kind of back and forth there was with the photographer. I find it so interesting in these collaborations, you know, attaching a story to a photo is a big responsibility. And was there back and forth, or was there just acceptance, or how did that?
There was actually Peter and I, thanks Liz, Peter and I have had a lot of back and forth about the book, but he made it clear to me at the outset that he, of course, has his own story about the photographs. He knows where and when he took them and who the people are and what the circumstances were. And so that's in him, and he owns that. But that he wasn't going to place any constraints on where my imagination led me. And he was frequently surprised. I was frequently surprised. As I mentioned in the horse story, many of the stories took a turn that I didn't expect. I didn't know that the girl hanging upside down in that early picture was going to end up in jail. I didn't know that the Selkie was going to decide, you know, it's not so bad here. Kira's pretty good company. And similarly, Peter would be surprised. And he's actually, among his favorite stories from the 50 are ones that really don't read that well. Any poet knows there are poems that read well, and I mean, I'm not a poet, but I know I have lots of poet friends. Some of my best friends are poets. And I'm looking at Allison here, and I'm looking at two other wonderful poets. But not every poem reads well, lends itself to a public reading. It's either too dense, it takes too much unfolding, or it's too long, or it's too short, or whatever. And similarly, maybe of the 50 tales, 30 or 35, I really enjoy reading. I've read probably that many in different settings over the last 5 years. The last one, by the way, the Selkie story and photograph are in the summer issue of Orion. Orion had published an earlier set of 4 or 5 of them, I forget, and terrain.org, which is a wonderful, wonderful website. Allison's involved with that, that everybody ought to know about it if you don't know about it. Terrain, TERRAIN.org. Just look it up. It's an amazing website for visual work, beautiful photography, for poetry, for essays, for fiction, for opinion pieces. It's really wonderful. And they've done a suite of them. Georgia Review has done a suite of them, a number of other publications. So 4 or 5 stories and photograph pairs. But only this spring have I been in a position to send a whole book out. So Liz, I'm sorry, I'm wandering around away from your question. Peter and I have talked about things like sequencing, because again, poets have to deal with this all the time. If you have 50 poems, what's the order, right? And you can shuffle them around. And I've never been faced, well, once before, actually. I have a little book of tales called Wilderness Plots, which is 50 little tiny stories. And I had to work out that sequence. So Peter and I have talked about that. He's asked me there are certain photographs, he said, could you do this one? Maybe it was one I hadn't picked. And in every case I did. If he wanted a story about it, I wrote a story about it. So we had that kind of give and take. But our friendship and our relationship embraces so much else that it has to do with conservation and social justice work and the work he and his wife do on their farm. So most of our phone, Zoom, and email correspondence actually isn't about this book. And poor Peter's been very patient, because his part was done. The photographs were all made before I started my part. And 5 years later, I finally finished my part. Now, of course, we have to find a publisher.
So there's a question in the Q&A, and you kind of touched on this, but maybe there's more. When your imagination takes you to a place you did not expect, how do you navigate that change and overcome any resistance?
Excellent question. There usually is resistance. Any writer knows that. Something comes up that does not follow the flow that you thought you were in. And your first impulse, my first impulse, is no, that's disruptive. That's a digression. That's misleading me somewhere. And often that's how it ends. And any one of us composing a sentence has words suggest themselves, and you consider it, say, no, that's completely wrong tone, it's the wrong register, it's the wrong rhythm, it's the wrong sound, and you reject it. So writers are constantly considering possibilities and having to discard all but one of them. You can only do one next thing, and all the other possibilities have to be pushed aside. But when there's a significant turn in a plot, it's a much more consequential decision. It's a bigger decision than this word or this rhythm or that rhythm in a sentence. It's a decision about what's the destination that this might lead to. And I sometimes use the chess analogy. A great chess player, I'm not a great chess player, but a great chess player can foresee the consequences of a move many steps ahead. And writers kind of do that in maybe a more clumsy, hectic way. They say, well, if I were to take that turn, what possibilities would that open up? But also, what possibilities would it close off? So the making of those choices happens constantly at all levels of composition. And when I feel resistance to something that would take a story or an essay in a significantly different direction than I had anticipated, I have to consider that a long time before I give into it. And in most cases, I don't give into it. But if it's insistent, and if it feels emotionally right, I will accept it and then follow what's implied by that change. And that moment when the farmer goes, sometimes before I read the horse essay or the horse story, I have to tell the audience what gelding means. It means castrating a male horse. But I mean, I grew up on and around farms, so I knew what gelding meant when I was 5 or 4 probably. But many contemporary audiences don't, some people in the audiences don't know. But he was just talking about, you know, people who benefit, males, various males who would benefit from gelding because they're just obnoxious, ugly human beings. The loudmouths in the bar who pinch the bottom of the waitress. But then he slid into the politicians who themselves have never worn a uniform, never risked their life, who will send a whole generation of men and women into another country on a trumped up war, in a trumped up war, and never admit that they made a mistake. And when that happened, and of course the anger about that and the grief about that is in me. It wouldn't be in him, that wouldn't be in him if it weren't in me. But it's in, of course, millions of us. And so when that arose, I didn't know it was going to, where that gelding was going to lead. But when it led there, I thought, yes, God damn it. those guys who send hundreds of thousands of young Americans to kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqis or Afghanis, that turn seemed authentic to me. It's something that a man who had lost a son in Iraq would feel. So that's a specific instance, but in response to the question about what happens when your writing wants to take a turn, how do you deal with the resistance?
Another question in the comments here from Sean Duke. It says, quite a lot of your work clearly plays around with speculative fiction, whether eco-critical sci-fi, or as you read a bit today, plays on folk tales and myth. What do you find compelling about these elements as aspects of your stories?
Another good question. Both science fiction and some kinds of fantasy, for me, I mean, in terms of what I'm drawn to, but especially folk tales. That's very astute because Selkies, there's a wonderful song I used to sing to my kids when they were little and would sit still for Dad's bad music. Dad's bad singing, the music's good, Dad's bad singing. Folk tales appeal to me a lot, as do science fiction writers like Ursula Le Guin. I mentioned her the other day, but she's a writer I greatly admire, and just was because she died alas a couple of years ago, a wonderful human being, extraordinary human being. They appeal to me because they give us the opportunity to look at ourselves, this two-legged strange creature that we are, and to look at our situation, our circumstances, our societies, to look at them from a different angle. So the best science fiction, in my mind, is science fiction which, no matter where it seems to be set, and no matter when it seems to be set, is really about right now. It's really about what we have to contend with right now. So folk tales, on the one hand, are timeless. They tend not to be set in particular times, but they do tend to help us reflect on human nature. And I do think there is such a thing as human nature. It's much more capacious, has much more possibilities in it than any one of us ever exhibits, and maybe even than a whole society exhibits. I think there are potentials in human beings that globally we haven't yet exhibited, but they're there. And one of them is to live at peace. And we can do that with one another and with our fellow species and with past generations and future generations. We have that capacity. And folktales talk to us about the potential within human beings. And the other thing, I'm mentioning one other thing about specifically about folktales, which is very relevant to this set of 50 stories in Ordinary Wealth, and that is their speed. Once upon a time, there was a miller and his wife who had a daughter. And when she was grown, she was beautiful, and a prince rode by one day on a horse and decided he must marry her. That's the first sentence, right? Look at all that happens. There is something thrilling about that velocity of narration, which for somebody like myself who has written 300, 400-page novels and also long essays that require a long time to accomplish whatever they're trying to accomplish, to be able to do all that in the first sentence or to be able to tell a whole story in 600 words is a really appealing alternative.
There's a question from Emily. Also, did you often find yourself torn between 2 or more story ideas for each picture? And if so, how did you know which one to go with?
I did imagine many alternatives for certain photographs, many, I mean, 3, 4, 5 possibilities. And I tended not to write any of them. I might make a few notes about this line, that line, the other line, but I didn't actually commit myself to composing, say, a first sentence, what might be a first sentence, until one of them had convinced me that it was the richest possibility. There were others where it was clear from the outset, the voice was clear, where the direction to go was clear, and so I just followed that path. I would say that there was no rush. This is not a book anybody's looking for, I mean, any publisher's looking for. I've never had to write for money. It's a great luxury. I've earned my living as a teacher. I'm very grateful for that. It's a very privileged life. So I've never had to write one word that I didn't want to write in order to earn money. But many writers, especially writers of nonfiction prose, have to earn a living that way. And so they end up having to do a fair amount of writing that maybe they wouldn't choose to do. And I have the luxury of not having to do that. So that's why I could spend 5 years on a book that I have no contract for, and I'm not sure who's going to publish it, if anybody, because it's be an expensive little book to produce because of all the color photos. So I could just stay with a photograph until one of the possibilities convinced me that it was the richest one, and then I would pursue it. I do make a lot of notes, just brainstorming notes before I start composing a story. Do the same with an essay, and with a novel, I might be making notes for months before I begin writing what might be a first page. And then often the real first page is on page 14 or in chapter 2 or something. In the same way with stories, the real beginning may be in the 3rd paragraph. And the first 2 paragraphs were just getting the engine going, clearing your throat before you actually started telling the real story.
Question from, let's see, it jumped on me 1 second. Oh, there we go. From Iris in the audience. I know that singer-songwriter Carrie Newcomer and you have collaborated. How is it to work with a songwriter who's inspired by your stories?
Carrie Newcomer, if you don't know her music, you look it up. Carrie Newcomer. She lives in Bloomington, Indiana, actually just outside of the city, and we've been friends for 25 years. And she's a wonderful singer-songwriter. And she and I have done quite a few concerts together where she does her songs and I do stories. I've done a few of these Ordinary Wealth tales and photographs with, PowerPoints on a screen somewhere at concerts with Carrie. But I have a whole other series of stories about a family named Milk, which is a part of a book I'm thinking of calling Who's Your Coyote. It's a funny book. It's a folktale book. And so Carrie and I have done those concerts as well. She doesn't make music for my stories, and I don't make stories for her music. We're just really doing parallel things in these concerts. There is one exception to that, and you can look this up on YouTube if you want. I published many years ago a little slender book, which just fell out of print last summer, called Wilderness Plots. Wilderness Plots. It's 50 stories with some wonderful line drawings in it by an artist from New Jersey. And each of those tales is just 2 pages long. And it had been in print many years and fallen out, and another publisher would pick it up. And then one day, about 10 years ago, a singer-songwriter who's a friend of Carrie Newcomer's and has become a real good friend of mine, called me one day and asked if he could stop by and tell me about a project he and friends were working on. I said, sure. I knew his name. I'd heard him sing a few times, but I didn't know him. Tim Grimm is his name. So he stops by and he says, well, I'm in a singer-songwriter group, and we play our new music for one another, and we give invitations and challenges to stuff, and then we all go on our separate touring careers and separate recording careers. And I came across your little book, Wilderness Plots. And I was standing in the bookstore, opened it up, looked at one of these stories. You could see the whole story on 2 pages. And I started hearing a song. And I thought, Turned a few more pages, opened another story, and heard another song. So he bought the book, took it home, and started writing songs. And then he took it to his singer-songwriter group and said it was his turn to offer a challenge. Sometimes they'd say, okay, everybody write a poem, a song that has a river in it, whatever, something from a headline in today's newspaper. So he said, okay, everybody borrow my copy. The library had 2 or 3 copies, or you can buy them in the used bookstore of this book, and pick a story and write a song about it. We do that for next month. So he's telling me all this. And he said, we had so many songs that we liked so much, and everybody had more stories they wanted to write songs about. So they said, so we'd actually like to make an album of songs inspired by these stories. And what do you think about that? I said, that's wonderful. He said, well, what kind of permission and compensation? I said, oh no, this is the folk process. If you find something in my stories that inspires you to write a song, God bless you. Go write songs and just let me hear them. That's exciting to me. And he paused and he said, wow, he said, we also want to do a stage show, which we would charge money for. What do you think about that? I said, wonderful, that's great. Good, more power to you. And he said, and we'd like you to be the narrator. Would you be the narrator? Yeah, sure, that sounds like fun. So for about 5 years, whenever these 5 musicians, all of them tour, Carrie Newcomer's one of them. There's another woman, Krista DeTour. That's why the girl in Moon is called Krista, because I have great affection for Krista. And Tom Rosnowski and Tim Grimm and Michael White, those are the other musicians. They all are singer-songwriters. They all make many recordings, and 4 of the 5 tour. So it was very hard for us to get all of us together to rehearse, let alone to schedule a show. But over 5 or 6 years, we did, I think, about 30 shows in half a dozen states around the Midwest. And PBS has in its files 2 concert documentaries. There's one that's a documentary about the making of Wilderness Plots, and there's another one which is just the concert. And they're fun. They're fun because the music is great. And it was a treat to have something I had made with no idea about music or concerts or stage shows adapted that way.
There's a question from Preeti. As a writer addressing issues, oh, it jumped on me. Sorry. Preeti's question, can you speak about the process of writing 20 books? How are you constantly reinventing yourself on the page? How do you keep yourself fresh artistically?
Curiosity, I've written in so many different modes: science fiction, children's books, I have a historical novel, short stories, novels, essays, a couple of book-length documentaries. I'm curious. I have a hodgepodge of knowledge, sort of in science and anthropology and languages and history, and I'm an expert in nothing. But I'm an amateur in a lot of things. And the root of amateur is one who loves. I love lots and lots of kinds of activities and bodies of knowledge. And so different subject matters, different materials lend themselves to different genres of writing. There's a liability you run into when you write many different kinds of books, as I have. No one publisher is ever going to publish somebody. No three publishers is ever going to publish somebody like myself, the full range of my books. They're just too heterogeneous. Not heterogeneous in their concerns, or their attitudes, or their values that inspire them. On the contrary, anybody who had the patience to read them all, kids' books, science fiction, historical fiction, essays, anybody who had the patience to read them all would see the interconnectedness of them. But as items to be sold in the marketplace, it would be an impossible task for a publisher. Those who heard the really useful and informative talk from Daniel Slager today would immediately understand. He'd just throw up his hand. He'd say, well, maybe I could do one of these books, but the other 19 just could not possibly. We can market those books. Our audience doesn't read those kind of books. So it's not so much that I've reinvented myself in some deliberate way, but that the world has claimed me in a new way. And I don't mean that to sound grandiose. I mean, just things happening in the world. My immediate life, my son, for example, has stage 4 cancer right now. And because of that, I ended up writing a number of essays that are in this new book that I wouldn't otherwise have written. But also the wars, perpetual wars, the extinction of so many species, the destruction of so many native languages, indigenous languages, on and on and on. The world keeps hurling at me, and of course hurling at all of us if we're paying attention. Global heating keeps hurling at me things that I feel moved to write about. And then I try to find a mode in which to write about it. So it's the world that's renewing me. And I hope I'll continue to write as long as I have my wits about me. I think I have them about me now, but I don't count on any definite length of time in front of me. One of my good friends I mentioned earlier is Wendell Berry. Actually, I mentioned him in a conference today, so I haven't said that to the rest of you. He's a good friend. He's one of my heroes. He's about half a generation older than I am. He's 85, I believe, this year. And he's less than half a generation older. But Wendell Berry has continued to write really important books into his 80s. So has Gary Snyder. So did William Butler Yeats. He wrote some of his best poetry in his 80s. I have got 6 years before I hit my 80s. I hope I'm still writing, and I hope I have something worth saying. And I also hope, if I no longer do have it, friends will tell me I don't. But publishers probably will be the first to tell me I don't.
There's a question in here that kind of is thinking in terms of that longevity of keeping the stamina to do all of this. And so as a writer addressing issues of social and environmental justice, how do you avoid activist fatigue and nurture your writing and probably yourself too?
Yeah. First, I'm not a classic activist. I've never been good at organizing. I did some street demonstrations during the Vietnam War and civil rights movement in the 60s, but I've been I've been a person who's spent a lot more time thinking and writing about social justice issues than out in the front lines working on it. And God bless the people who are out in the front lines working on it, as they are in their hundreds of thousands at this moment, here and abroad. But they're called to do that, and I'm glad and I'm grateful to them for doing it. So I haven't burned myself out with that kind of activism, organizing, pamphleting. I did that during the Vietnam War, and I did get very tired of it and got jailed for it, and never suffered any real consequences for it, bad consequences for it. But what of course I have to contend with, and I dare say everybody who's listening to this has to contend with it, is grief. Sometimes it's called ecological grief. We're living in the midst of the decimation of species of life and habitats on our planet. And we are the cause. We collectively as a species are the cause. There's no question about it. And anyone who has even an inkling of that has to live with grief. So it's more grief than burnout that I have to contend with. And which is why one of my books is called Hunting for Hope. If you have it, if hope is something, oh, you just bubble up. Some people are just bubble up with hope all the time. I'm not such a person. You probably have gathered that. On the other hand, when I'm asked, as I am implicitly asked right here, do I have hope? What I say is, I believe in the possibility of change, that humans can change. Because I've been a teacher for 50 years. I have seen countless people change. I have been changed by reading, by people I meet, by teachers, by friends, by figures in the world that I've never met, but have learned from, like Martin Luther King, like Gandhi. I know humans can change, and I wouldn't be writing if I didn't think humans could change. I wouldn't be teaching this or anything else if I didn't think humans would change. We're not fixed. We're not finished. We are creatures who have an open-ended potential. And you know that when you sit down to write. Your work is not finished. It is not closed. There's a space in front of you. And into that, your imagination can go, your heart can go, your reasoning can go. And that's what keeps me going. If I'm asked, do I think things are going to turn out fine? I say, no. I don't know how things are going to turn out, but there's going to be a lot more suffering. There's a lot of suffering now. There's going to be more. And we're going to change. And there are going to be three primary driving forces of that change. One of them is catastrophe. That's what we're contending with right now. When 2.3 million Americans, and of course it's tragedy all over the planet, but 2.3 million Americans have contracted a disease nobody knew about before about last November. That's a catastrophe. When much of California is burning, or the forest near Allison Deming's house in Tucson is burning, and there's drought in Africa. That is catastrophe, and that drives change. And most of the change is tragic. People die, animals die, land is ravaged. So that's one of the drivers of change is catastrophe. Another driver of change is coercion. That's what, when the Chinese had the single child policy for 20 years, that appalls most of us. And yet, if they hadn't, today there would be 1 billion Chinese starving. We have to remember those two things are true. To deliberately, by coercion, limit population is a terrible intrusion into human privacy. Just as outlawing abortion is a terrible intrusion into human privacy. But coercion, which we see a lot of during this pandemic in this country, lockdowns, et cetera, orders for mask wearing and so forth. That's coercion. Dictatorships are coercion. Okay, catastrophe, coercion, and the third one is culture. Culture can drive change. It can change consciousness. It can change social relationships. And culture includes all the arts, all the humanities, science, all the ways that humans think and make sense and convey and express their understanding about the world and about their lives. That's culture. And what I always say is, I don't like catastrophes. I don't like coercion. I love culture. And culture is what I'm voting for. Culture is what my little tiny contribution as a teacher and as a writer and a public speaker, my little tiny contribution is going to be to culture. Because the more change that we can bring about towards a peaceful, sustainable, just, humane society and economy here and around the world, the more of that that can be driven by humans making art, doing science, making music, thinking about what the meaning of life should be, what a good life is, the more of that we can do through culture, the less suffering there will be, and the better future there will be for our species and for our fellow species.
Thank you, Scott. That was, I think we'll end there on culture.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Gallery, please unmute yourselves. You have to give him a huge round of applause.
You faithful ballet, I appreciated your company. And all the other people out there whose faces I can't see, but I appreciate your company as well.
And are surely applauding you. Thank you. All right. Dear conference attendees, there is no craft conversation in the morning. Enjoy your workshops, your gathering spaces, and we will see you in the afternoon at the participant reading. Thank you for coming. I will see some of you tomorrow in the afternoon. Hopefully all of you and then some will join us tomorrow evening for the next reading. Have a good night.